Okay. Bill, you have an illustrious career, to say the least. I'm going to start with a little bit of your bio, and then ask you a few questions. And the first question, of course, is how am I sounding? Are you hearing me okay at this point?
Yeah, you sound like you have a sore throat, but other than that,
let's hope it's only a sore throat these days. This meeting, of course, this event is sponsored by the Society of Professional Journalists, the New England branch, and which I'm a member. And we are, I want to thank Adam for helping to put this meeting together. You, Bill, until recently, till April 2019, you were the editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project. Everyone is probably familiar with the Marshall Project, a nonprofit independent news organization focused on crime and punishment in the United States, for which you've won quite a few awards, and deservedly so. You're currently a member of the board of directors. From July 2003 until September 2011, you served as the executive editor of the New York Times, without question the premier newspaper in the United States. And you were chief of the Times, the New York Times Bureau in Johannesburg from 1992 until May 1995. And you covered the end of apartheid in South Africa. We should talk about that sometime. I was there right after that for Nelson Mandela's ascension and the end of apartheid. And from December 1986 to October 1991, you were the Times correspondent in Moscow, reporting on the easing and ultimate collapse of communist rule, the fall of the wall, and the breakup of the USSR. And in 1989, you won the Pulitzer Prize for your coverage. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Bill, we're doing this because we're all stuck at home. We are self-quarantining, at least in the Northeast and in New York, other places that are still under stay-at-home orders or advisories and so on and so forth. And that's the reason we're doing this by Zoom. I'm wondering, when you look at the coverage over the last 3 months, let's just say starting in January, I want to do an overview. How would you assess the coverage over that period? January, February, March, April, and now May.
I guess I should start by saying that I mainly consume national media.
No problem.
Not so much I don't really have a local paper, except we're now hunkered down in Southampton, and I read the Southampton Press once a week. But basically, I read the Times, the Post. I listen to a lot of NPR. I read New Yorker, Atlantic, and then I subscribe to a number of lists, aggregators who point me in directions that I wouldn't otherwise go in. So, but I can't claim to know, have a full picture of the coverage nationwide. What I've been following, I think, is heroic. It's been, the investigative reporting has not flagged. There's a lot of service journalism that can range from ridiculous to the sublime, I guess, but that's what people need is, what should I be watching tonight? Because I've got a few hours to kill. What can I cook with what I've got in my kitchen for my family? How do I help my kid get through remote learning? That kind of service journalism, we tend to dismiss that sometimes as soft stuff, or not what they pass out prizes for. but it's what people want and need. And then the coverage of the politics of it, I think has been really excellent. You know, back in 2016, the week after the election, I got a phone call from Jim Schachter, who was then the vice president for news at WNYC. He's now the president of New Hampshire Public Radio. And Jim called up, and we're all friends from the New York Times days, and he called up and said, "My newsroom is in despair. You know, we've elected a president who regards us as, you know, not worth scraping off the bottom of his shoe. By the way, how did we miss this story? Everybody thought it was going to come out the other way." So he asked me if I would come down and sort of play Dr. Phil and, you know, try to convince them that the world was not about to end. So I went down and sat on a stage with Brooke Gladstone, and we tried to find silver linings in the Trump victory. And a lot of those silver linings, I confess to being a chronic optimist, but I think a lot of those silver linings have been particularly evident in the coronavirus coverage. I mean, you know, the work has been so good that it's times like this that people appreciate why we have a free press. And, you know, yes, it's true that we have a broken business model, especially for local papers. And yes, it's true that polls tend to show that the public trust in the news media is way too low. And yes, we compete on a digital playing field with a lot of trolls and, you know, alt-right maniacs and fake news. But I think it's something like coverage of a crisis, and especially one that touches just about everybody, demonstrates to the general public something that nobody on this call needs to be told, which is that we're essential personnel in the survival of democracy.
But and one of the things about you, Bill, is that you come at this as an optimist. A lot of people are less optimistic for various reasons. I'm listening to my audio. It's not that great, is it? Hold on just a second. Just a little bit. I'm hearing. Are you hearing? Go. Bill?
Yeah.
Are you hearing an echo?
Yeah, you're breaking up. It's worse now.
It's worse now. Okay. I'm gonna talk as little as possible then. Investigative reporting. How would you describe that? And I'm not just talking about the New York Times, the Post. I know you haven't read the Globe, but I think our own newspaper have done a really great job. How would you describe investigative reporting at this point into this aspects of this pandemic? Prisons, for example, is one story focused on, which has become an expertise for you in recent years, but also food supply and so forth.
Yeah, well, as I say, I only have a sample of what's being done out there. And, I mean, investigative reporting has been under duress for quite a while. Just because, you know, in the last 15 years, 2,000 local newspapers have closed down, and you've all read about the news deserts and the downsizing in newsrooms everywhere. And, you know, the investigative reporters tend to be among the first to go because their work takes time, costs money, pisses people off. So I would say that investigative reporting has faced challenges long before the coronavirus. And to my mind, that makes it all the more impressive that as much of it is being done as is being done. You know, I don't know what's happening everywhere, but certainly the national media that I follow have continued to dig deep. And yeah, there are certainly stories yet to be told. Uh,
Go on, I'm sorry.
hmm. No, I'm sure there are stories that are being missed, but I think given the fact that people are operating either from their basement, or for those who do venture out, they're essentially like war correspondents. Given those stresses, um, I would give the media in general high marks.
And is there a particular area where you would give them high marks?
I'm sorry?
Is there a particular area where you would give high marks to? Is there a area in particular?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's only one story really, and it connects to everything else. The virus connects, of course, to the Trump administration, and that connects to climate control, and it connects to international relations. But I would give the press especially high remarks for reporting on the dysfunction within the Trump administration. I've seen some polling that shows that Trump gets higher, the people are more inclined to trust Trump on the virus situation than they are to trust the news media. I don't know if that's a reliable poll or not. If it was, it's certainly becoming much less true. Trump is not getting away with the bullshit.
I haven't seen that poll. The polls I've seen suggest that he is losing public trust in terms of his framing of this pandemic, starting, of course, with his pandemic press conferences each night.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He got a couple of points bump in the early days, the sort of rally around the flag thing, less than other presidents have gotten in national crisis, and then it's been going down steadily. And I think the polling after his suggestion that we all inject ourselves with sterilizer, disinfectant, I expect the numbers are going to keep going down. I mean, he's kind of committing political suicide in public.
Let's talk about the coverage of the pandemic press conference for a second. There have been criticism, actually, of reporters that when Donald Trump has chosen to attack other reporters, a PBS reporter, a CBS reporter, disproportionately women who have been attacked, and attack is the only word that is applicable here, tended to be attacked by the president. Some feel that other reporters have not responded in a way that is unusual. Talk about that.
Well, a couple of things about those press conferences. I mean, my main problem with the press conferences is that so many news outlets just run them unedited, uninterrupted from start to finish, which is, it's not journalism to hand somebody a microphone for an hour and not challenge what he has to say. That's the biggest problem with the press conferences I see. I understand why they're doing it. There's a kind of reverence for the office of the presidency, in a sense that anything he does, what he says moves markets and moves armies, and he's the president, so you got to record it. And plus, in Trump's case, there's this sort of traffic accident quotient. There are a lot of people who are watching it not because they're fans of the president, but just because they can't wait to see what weird thing he's going to come up with today, so that it drives eyeballs. But I gather some news outlets, I think CNN and maybe NPR, are talking about, rather than running the press conferences uninterrupted, backing off a little bit and supplying context in real time, which I think if they can coordinate it would be well worth doing. As far as the sense of, I was just going to say, as far as the solidarity among reporters, I mean, I think everybody feels that, but there's a risk in making it seem like the press corps is an organized opposition that is strategizing for ways to take down the president. It plays into the hands of Steve Bannon. And it risks also making us seem defensive. You know, that you insulted my colleague. You have no respect for the press, and that kind of plays into his hands.
Well, that's a good point. I think. Wow. I'm an audio guy, and I'm not. My audio is horrendous. That plays into the hands. Perhaps that's one perception. The other perception, however, is that where you find a situation where the president is being disingenuous, self-deifying, and indeed subverting real information in place of using, in fact, engaging in misinformation, that reporters would be well positioned, if you will, to not so much band together, but to support the others of objective questioning, for example.
You know, early on in this administration, when Steve Bannon was still there, you know, from the Breitbart guy, he described the press as the opposition party. And one of my big worries in the first few years of the Trump administration was that we'd start to act like the opposition party. And that allows him to categorize us as partisan, not trustworthy, not unbiased. And I think for the most part, we have not done that. It's a hard thing to split, because on the one hand, you want to make sure that, you know, in print and on broadcast in real time, when the president says something that's just dishonest or self-aggrandizing, you call him on it, not wait until the bottom of the article to do it either, but and that's been happening. You know, you see articles written in which it just says, President Trump says X, but actually Y. And that's good, that's our job. But what I think, things I think that we collectively have been pretty good at is not letting, well, of course it's not true because it's Trump, you know, or making it sound ad hominem, or reflexive or partisan.
And that's a good point. And I'm not sure how much more can be said about that, but the pandemic press conferences have served symbolically for many people to also have folks questioning whether or not reporters have gained more courage, years, if you will, after some misstep after misstep. It's certainly more. But this not have given an opportunity to dissuade the public of that assumption.
Somebody, I don't remember who, referring to this subject about, you know, whether, I think they were talking about whether Biden should get more engaged in challenging Trump head on. And they said, when a guy's digging his own grave, you don't hand him a shovel. You don't try and take away the shovel. Sorry, I'm not good at joke telling. But you know, I think that's kind of true. I mean, his ratings are going down not because of the questions he's being asked, but because of the meandering stream of consciousness, fantasy land, self-aggrandizing, you know, just incompetence.
And let me Bill, you as your Bible chief, the executive editor, during the Iraq.
Philip, you're breaking up.
I'm so sorry. Let me see if I can change this a bit.
Change this a bit.
How's that?
How's that?
It's still a little out of sync.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's see if we can.
Let's see if we can.
Sorry, folks.
Sorry, folks.
Two microphones
Two
activated.
microphones activated.
I'm not sure.
See
See if I can change this.
if I can change this.
Well, let's do
Well,
this.
let's do this.
Mute your mic for just,
Mute your mic for just a second.
I can do it here for you.
I can do
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Hold on, I'll mute it.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Ah, I see what was happening. Yeah, it was my voice coming out of your computer, Bill. That's why folks have asked me to mute your mic. Thanks, Uriah. Who else said something? Bruce.
Bruce.
Hold on, just Bill, let me just you here. So here, I guess the one question would be this: in covering the Iraq War. Now, you were heavily criticized, of course, and this goes into your thinking about coverage across the board. You were criticized as not as allowing information basically to seep through that was questionable in some people's minds, so on and so forth. As a columnist, you, if you will, and please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this. You supported the Iraq War, but during the war, during the coverage of the war itself, not as a columnist, but as executive editor, are there any lessons there that you would extrapolate from your coverage during that time that we can apply currently to the coverage of this latest crisis, this very different crisis, but a crisis nevertheless, the pandemic?
Yeah, well, I certainly take the full blame for the columns I wrote, and I've written fairly copiously explaining, trying to figure out how I got it so wrong. The short answer is I wasn't cut out to be a columnist. Actually, it's a more complicated answer than that. But I did, you know, when Bush and Cheney sent the troops off to Iraq, they did it with my blessing as a columnist. The reporting leading up to the war, I wasn't there for. I was in my happy exile as a columnist. It's only that from what other people have told me and written, and you know, it's kind of, we'll boil it down to Judy Miller, who ostensibly was the problem. I think she was a symptom of the problem. And yes, there are lessons to be learned from that coverage. One of them is don't let yourself get overexcited by the front pageness of a story to the extent that you don't bother to check the story. Another thing is that, you know, while I'm a big believer that leadership means trusting your people, I also believe in the now a cliche of Ronald Reagan's trust but verify. And I guess one other clear lesson is when the heat of the moment has passed, which it had pretty much done by the time I came down from the columnist area and became executive editor, go back and read report. There's a lot of stuff about this virus that we don't even know what we don't know. And so when we get through it, there'll be, I expect a number of reporters are already making target lists for things they'd like to go back and re-examine, you know, after the fact, who did stuff right, who made a fair amount of this going on about big businesses profiteering off of scarce supplies and the payroll protection money going to people who probably don't need it or deserve it. A lot of that's going on, but you know, one of the things that I did, maybe it was an act of penance, but when I became executive editor, is we set teams loose to do a couple of stories on things that we had gotten wrong, and dug in things like the famous aluminum tubes that were supposedly part of Saddam Hussein's nuclear arsenal. You know, there were a bunch of stories like that that I take some pride in.
Well, one thing that's clear now is that there are two stories that seem to be developing that I'd like you to comment on in the context of this pandemic. One, of course, is the continuing science, the notion of a cure. Everyone rushed to cover Dr. Fauci's press conference yesterday at the White House with news of a possible cure. And there seemed to be some suggestion by groups like FAIR, for example, that perhaps this wasn't well vetted. I know FAIR has an agenda, and an agenda that lies on the left, but their points seem to be well established. That perhaps there should be a closer look at the science. The other developing story concerns China. The provenance of this virus is believed to have been Wuhan, China. Now there seems also to be an effort by the Trump administration to make China the boogeyman. Now there's a lot of objective coverage of what China has done and hasn't done. It's clear that they have obfuscated the Chinese authorities. It's clear that they have outright lied in some instances about aspects of this virus. But the question I have really is, how do we basically get through the clutter of the politics of the moment that promulgated largely by the Trump administration and the objective reality, that is to say, of China's role in all of this, and of course, to get to the real science. What are your views about that? I hope my question is clear in that context.
Yeah, and it's a good question. It's maybe the sort of ultimate question is, how do you cut through when you've got this shitstorm of disinformation, wishful thinking, partisanship? How do you cut through it and give readers clear, understandable facts? Fauci's comments yesterday, I think, I mean, I didn't watch the press conference, but I heard excerpts of his comments on this new medicine on NPR this morning. And he didn't say that it was a cure or that it was even close to a cure. He was very careful to say that there are some tests that suggest that it might shorten the duration of the illness from, I don't know what he's, 15 days to 11 days on average. But that's not a cure or a vaccine. And I think, again, I haven't read, I don't really know what CNN and MSNBC or Fox News did with those and with Fauci's remarks. The stock market, of course, seemed to take it as a sign, but the stock market is a crazy way to measure what's going on in the world. I think, you know, the news that I follow anyway has gotten pretty skeptical about these miracle cures or potential cures. You know, NPR and the Times, which are probably my two main sources of day-to-day news, have both developed a roster of experts who really know their stuff, epidemiologists and other scientists, and they go to them to fact check what comes out of the political wing of the government, and I think they've been quite good at that. China is, you know, China has probably been covered more fitfully because, for one thing, a lot of correspondents have been kicked out of China, the U.S. correspondents, which is a shame both for us and for the Chinese. If they'd had a free press, they might have stopped things a lot earlier than they did. I do know that, you know, it's so easy to beat up on Fox News, and I'm happy to do it all night, because they're a travesty. But I'm quite sure that they've seized on this cure, or they've seized on the China angle, and sort of clearing the way for Trump to try and tie Biden to China in the campaign. And I hope that he won't get away with that. I mean, it's our responsibility to see that he doesn't get away with that.
I must say to also to the both broadcast media and print media's credit, they seem to be very careful. This is from what I'm reading in the Post, in the New York Times, Boston Globe, LA Times. I've also taken a look at the Miami Herald, Chicago Tribune, Detroit Free Press. And they seem to be very careful in looking at this China story, covering that which is clearly verifiable, but not falling for, if you will, the Fox angle of seeing this as a way of exculpating the president from his own lack of attention to the coronavirus largely in February. Fox, however, has done something else too, which has put out a lot of misinformation and disinformation about cures, about medicines, basically reflecting on the president's own political agenda. The problem I have with that is that it has led to many, in some instances, apparent efforts to actually try some of these things. What has been the real harm and problem, if you will, with we can always talk about whether there's conservative news, there's liberal news, but there's some news that's actually engaged in real disinformation and misinformation, where there have been very real consequences. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think there's a real value in having trust and having a kind of common set of the facts to play with. I mean, to run a democracy and hold leaders accountable, you can't have two diametrically opposed versions of the truth. And you know, but one thing I will say, because it's a pet peeve of mine, is I think we have an audience problem. I mean, there's plenty of blame to be leveled at the media for its shortcomings. But I think we've raised a generation, or maybe two, of people without any fundamental sort of media literacy. They used to call it physics when I was in grade school. We teach them the skills to discern the difference between something that's reliable and something that's not. You essentially teach them sort of systematic skepticism. There's an outfit which I've just gone on their advisory board, the News Literacy Project, which makes curricula for I think at this point it's mostly junior high school and high school kids, helping them to identify, okay, what is the purpose of this particular piece of information you're reading? How is to look for the sourcing and basically make a reasonable guess as to whether it's trustworthy or not. And I think that's certainly a priority.
I have to point out what I thought was what I've been looking at over the last few weeks, some really good coverage is the Economist. I don't know if you read the Economist, but issue after issue has been very thorough in terms of coverage of the pandemic, including taking on the president's comments early on in terms of an analysis way back in January, addressing the instances and the problems with the coverage in terms of real world impact. Bill, I think I have one other question to ask you, and then I think we should open it up to our audience here. I want to go back again to the coverage of crises. There is not just, of course, the Iraq example, but there was another very huge crisis with Ebola. And do you think that Porter's fell short in terms of the coverage of that disease because it largely prevailed it largely existed in Africa? And I'm asking this because now a number of questions have come up about the novel coronavirus. We now know, and I only found this out recently, that this Ebola was and SARS, a number of other things. Obviously, they're just another type of virus. But then there's this whole notion of the connections between viruses. And again, it's mainly a science question. And I'm just wondering, do you think that we've made the connections well, looking at the connections between SARS, MERS, and of course, Ebola, in terms of how we're covering the situation today? And by we, of course, I'm talking about us as journalists. Your view on that?
No, I don't think we've done a good enough job. I think there's a tendency, I'm not singling out any particular news organization for this, I think there's a general tendency to confine science stories to the science section or the science page. And we often miss nobody sees these things coming except scientists. And so, it's part of our natural, we sort of quarantine scientific information. The president did it, but so did we. I've just this week started reading Lawrence Wright's new book. Wright did The Looming Tower and staff writer for New Yorker, a great reporter. He's written a novel called The End of October, which is, this is either great timing on his part or terrible timing, I'm not sure which, but it's being published in the middle of a pandemic. And I won't give you any spoilers. Go read it yourself. But one of the clear messages that of the novel is that how this information gets sidetracked, ignored. There's always something more important that pushes it aside. And besides, scientists talk in these big long words, and they use a lot of numbers, and there's always something more important. The stock market is up or down. And to the first part of your question, I do think that in the case of Ebola, the fact that its locus was in Africa was definitely a factor. It's, there are not that many US news organizations that maintain any kind of a reporting presence in Africa, which is sad. That as a former Africa hand, I think we miss a lot.
I did notice that Reuters did look at, I went back and I looked at some, went back and looked at some of the coverage, and Reuters seems to have, and I mean, obviously it's a British organization, but they seem to have done a very good job of making the connection. And it's something I think should be emulated by the American Press Corps. But I think at this point we will open this up, unless you'd like to respond to that.
Well, just to say that, there is an advantage. Reuters and the BBC and The Economist, which you just held up, I suppose you could say that there's an advantage to having been a major colonial power. Or maybe it's just that they're a small island, but they pay much more attention to the rest of the globe than we do to the world outside our boundaries. And I'm not just saying that because I have an English wife.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry?
I'm not just saying that because I have an English wife. Can't hear you.
All right.
Thanks for that.
Thanks for that.
You're breaking up visually and or audio or orally.
I was saying, thanks for clarification. I appreciate that.
Appreciate that.
I'm going to mute you for just a second, and I'm going to, oops. Okay, there we go. What? If anyone else has beyond to what I've asked, let me Adam, can you mute everyone? If you want, but if you folks want to ask a question, and it looks like Susie muted, go ahead and do so, please.
I was wondering what role prejudice plays in coverage. Does it hinder full coverage where there is so much prejudice out there? You mentioned Africa for the Ebola virus, and we have seen some incidences levied against the Chinese American community, other communities, but so I don't know. Does it seem that this is hindering coverage in any way, for good or for bad reasons? In other words, if journalists don't want to go there, even address it, opening a can of worms, perhaps? Is this casting this?
In the case of Africa, it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, I think. Reporters don't want to go there because your stories don't get put on the front page if you're writing from Zimbabwe. And therefore, the best reporters don't go there, and therefore the stories don't get on the front page. It's a sort of cyclical thing. I don't think, I mean, I think there is a sort of first world condescension towards the third world, which is a little different from just racial prejudice. I don't know, maybe I'm not sure that the prejudice particularly influences coverage decisions, but it influences politics and policy. And we covered politics and policy, and sometimes it's hard to root out the prejudice. I mean, the most obvious example being the treatment of Muslims after 9/11. I think that was and still is very much informed by prejudice. Immigration policy is very much informed by prejudice against Latinx people. I think at its best, the media serves as an antidote to that. You try to call them out when they, when the president talks about rapists coming across the border from Mexico. I mean, our job is, I'm sure we all have prejudices of one kind or another, some of them benign and some of them not so benign, but it's our business to set those aside and go after the facts. And at our best, that's what we do. That answer your question, sort of?
Yeah, I mean, in Brookline, where I live, we right from the beginning had an event supporting the Chinese community at a Sichuan restaurant before restaurant restrictions were imposed. And it was very well received. Of course, this is Brookline, but I haven't seen too much like that, except for articles where people are urged to support Chinatown businesses. I have just felt that there's some sort of filter placed on that whole issue of confronting it, because I feel there is a hidden prejudice. And maybe, I don't know, that could help with international relations somehow, rather than just covering it over. So in Brookline, we did.
I mean, the Trump reelection campaign already has talking points to try and connect Biden to China, and there's a unmistakable, not very well hidden racism in that campaign. But again, our job is not to just sort of take it for granted and get jaded by it, but to call it out every time we see it.
Sometimes I just thought, I'm sorry, I'm muted. Oh, sometimes calling it out can, like I say, open a can of worms, and people might be afraid of that. Okay, let someone else.
You have a question?
Yeah. Hi, Bill. Maybe the old rules don't apply in journalism. Maybe we really have entered a new age. You talk about listening to the BBC and NPR, reading The Economist and the New York Times and the Reuters. I mean, we're in a pretty rarefied atmosphere here, and we seem to be talking to ourselves. And yeah, but maybe the truth no longer sets you free, and we need new rules for the game. Do we?
Well, like what?
I wouldn't want to become Fox, but it's when we're the enemies of the people. Are we showing up at a gunfight with a knife? I don't know what, I mean, what are the alternatives? I'm asking, because it doesn't seem that the ways of doing stuff, of being accurate and honest, are working. I'm not saying we should be inaccurate and unhonest. Is there something else we can be doing?
I think I'll stick with accurate and honest. I mean, truth is an aspirational concept. It's, we don't often get something perfectly right, but it's the effort that counts. Just a million years ago, Glenn Greenwald and I had a sort of online debate. Glenn believes fervently that journalists should acknowledge their political leanings up front, disclose their opinions on the issues at hand, and then let the reader judge for himself whether he trusts the material or not. I've spent a couple of stints doing opinion journalism, and I'm certainly not opposed to it, as long as as long as it's called what it actually is. But I do believe there's a really important place for news organizations that can be trusted to approach a subject with an open mind, and that makes it all the more powerful when you when you do say something, when you do draw conclusions. You can't be as easily dismissed as, oh, that's so-and-so, he or she is a well-known partisan and clearly leans left, leans right.
I guess I'm asking if we should use different tools. I'm thinking of, many people get their news from late night TV comedians. Keith Olbermann was more a performance artist than he was a journalist.
Yeah, I
Maybe,
once
I'm
heard
sorry, go ahead.
I once heard Jon Stewart at a breakfast, and somebody asked him essentially that same question. That a lot of people turn into your show to find out what the news is. You are our news source. And he said, basically, that's bullshit. I mean, yes, new ways of approaching the news. I mean, 10 years ago, nobody had a team in their newsroom called fact checkers. A lot of places still don't, but there's PolitiFact and a bunch of others that just exist to check information, often the president's information or his claims. I think that's a relatively new genre that should be encouraged. Podcasts didn't exist all that long, haven't existed for all that long, but they've become a way to reach people who, are back in the days when people could actually drive their cars to work. You can intercept people when they're kind of a captive audience. A lot of people are doing great things with graphics, interactive graphics, using the tools of the internet to tell stories in a different way. So I mean, the what is now of the mainstream media, that the objective reporting, fairly presented, is a relatively new thing, like maybe a century old in this country. Journalism, if you want to call it that, has evolved from colonial days when it was pamphleteers run by the postmaster or the local print shop. It's gone through tabloid phases. It's gone through the muckrakers phases, and journalism and the news have proven to be a pretty adaptable profession. And as I understand it, one of the purposes of SPJ is to encourage that level of professionalism, that, but not dependent on which media. You don't have to read the print edition of the New York Times or work for the print edition of the New York Times to be a professional journalist. There are lots of different ways we can get our work out.
Okay. Let's do this. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have an important question, Mary. But we have Lisa, who has a. In mind, folks, we have less than minutes left. Here we go, Lisa.
Okay, thanks. I think you called on me, Philip. I couldn't hear everything. Hi, it's Lisa Mullins. I work for an NPR station in Boston, and I was just wondering, I missed the beginning of this, so I apologize, but I heard that you're not a fan of Fox, and I just wonder if you have things that you've heard on center or even left media or seen where you think they could have done better. And I'm looking for kind of a challenge in the interest of better journalism as we continue on this story and then the election to come after this.
There's nothing that I consume on the left side or at the center that compares with the audacity of Fox. I mean, that's a one-of-a-kind outlet. I mean, its relationship with the president is so joined at the hip that it's not a joke to refer to them as state television. Although they seem to, even Fox seemed to be a little offended at the idea that we should be injecting ourselves with disinfectant. So there, maybe there's a divorce on the way. I haven't seen anything comparable to that on the left, but that's maybe because I don't read the sort of more polemical, I mean that in a nice way, the more polemical publications on the right. I mean, I do sometimes find it jarring when one of the publications I do follow sort of slips into the role of opposition party and sounds just a little too much, like, well, let me put it this way. During the summer of 2016, I remember watching this kind of evolution of the coverage of the campaign. At the beginning of the summer, it was kind of Donald Trump says X, Hillary Clinton says Y, the old even-handed trick. Then it kind of became Donald Trump says X, but actually, which I think is the sweet spot where we ought to be. And then sometimes it would sort of slip into Donald Trump says X, but you can't believe anything he says, which he comes close to justifying, but I think that's to be avoided so that we don't, portray ourselves or internalize the notion that we are the opposition party.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
Thank you. Mary has a very important question upon this a little. By the way, we can go a few minutes after 8, but not. Mary says, just as a comment, as a scientist, I'm disappointed that there's not been much clarification offered regarding Donald Trump's treatment recommendations like hydrochloroquine. I encourage more with research science to help people understand why a suggestion like that is, well, you say you're mature. I would use another word or another term. It's not premature, it's outright dangerous. But the feeling is that this is something that should be addressed by scientists, reporters talking to more scientists. What's your view?
Well, I'm all in favor of talking to scientists. I mean, the places that I get my news seem to be quite well sourced among the scientific community, and on these kind of presidential endorsements of mythical cures, I think they've done a particularly good job of pointing out not only that these are untested, but that they could be real dangerous. And I mean, the New York Times is not just saying that on the editorial page; they're saying it on the front page. NPR isn't just treating it as commentary. They're bringing you the recorded voices of the scientists saying themselves that this is dangerous. In the case of the disinfectant, you have the companies that make disinfectants issuing statements saying, please do not try to do this. So, I mean, could we do more and better? I always hope so. That's why I say truth is aspirational. But I think at least the serious news media have been very clearly on the side of science in this one.
Bill, on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much. And I thank our audience here, our fellow journalists. One thing I will say also is I think that some of the networks, particularly NBC, in terms of covering this coronavirus situation. But again, that's my thought, my my opinion. But Bill, I want to thank you for talking with us, Society of Professional Journalists, New England chapter, and looking forward to your writing, trying to write something about the coverage of prisons, which seems to be the missing link. Folks have focused on it, but there still doesn't seem to be enough attention. It's clearly an extraordinary problem, as extraordinary as the coverage of the meatpacking industry, for example.
Yeah,
guys,
well,
go ahead, Bill. Sorry.
sorry.
I'm sorry? Hello?
Oh, you can go ahead, Bill. Sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, okay.
look, it's a subject we could take a whole hour on any time, and I'm game to do it. The only regular schedule, when I retired from the Marshall Project last year, I decided to try a little bit of teaching, which I mostly avoided. And I did a journalism seminar at Princeton, and then organized a seminar in Sing Sing prison for inmates on basically an introduction to the news business and journalism. We got through 4 classes before they shut the prisons down to all outsiders, and I'm really eager to get back and find out, you know, whether any of my students or whether all my students are safe. So my view of this goes a little beyond journalism and into the realm of the personal. There's nothing like teaching a class full of eager people who are serving up to life sentences, to put a human face on the prison problem.
I think this is where we get that almost a reflection of something Bruce Gellerman was saying, and that the personal can indeed be journalistic, depending on how you approach it. And I'm very much looking forward to you perhaps writing about what happened with these folks at Sing Sing. Yeah, Bill, thank you very much. Much appreciated.
All right.
And before we leave, I just want to say thank you to you, Bill, and to you, Philip, for doing this discussion. And I want to also say thanks to you guys for kind of dealing with us with any questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
There's a lot of stuff you could be watching. So you chose me over Lion King and the finale of Homeland.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, guys.
So long.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, folks.